So Paul, what have you been up to, man? I saw you exploring the world a little bit.
Yes, I have been exploring the world. This year I've been out to the States, but as part of my research for the Eden series, I have been out in Turkey. I was invited by our mutual friend Matt LaCroix to be part of the scouting team for his forthcoming movie on Lost Ionis. And I was part of the scouting team exploring certain archaeological sites which are just now beginning to be re-excavated. They were discovered about 50 years ago, and what was found 50 years ago raised some very interesting questions about human timelines. And then certain symbology was found carved into basalt. What did that mean? So we were out there looking at that, and Matt's really pursuing the question of how this informs the question of timelines for humanity, the emergence of humanity. My focus is very much in narrative traditions. So my focus has been on the symbols that have been found there. What stories did they tell? Did they give an account of human history that differs to what you and I may have learned in school? And I found, yes, it certainly does. And the stories that they tell in what was ancient Armenia correlate with ancestral narratives from all around the world, pointing back to a time when humanity was rebooted with assistance from another civilization.
Wow, amazing. This is amazing information. And what I'd like to do before we dig deep into the topic tonight about the origins of religion and talk a little bit about our upcoming workshop that we're going to be doing together in just a few short weeks. Can you please give a brief biography to the people as to where you came from, who you are, what your career was, and where you are now?
For sure. Well, people today know me as the paleo-contact guy, and all the books in the Eden series and many of our documentaries on the fifth kind are about paleo-contact. And that's the theory that our ancestors in the deep past had contact with other civilizations, by which I mean extraterrestrial civilizations. And my route into this area of study surprises people because my background is in church ministry. I was for 33 years in church-based ministry. I worked as a church doctor, a church planter, a theological educator, and an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And these are all really interesting positions. The theological educator was fascinating because I was training pastors, and I was training them in particular in how to interpret ancient texts, the principles of hermeneutics. And it was those disciplines that when I applied them to certain anomalies in the Bible, I realized, oh, hang on, there are some other stories in the Bible lying beneath the surface. And when we identify those narratives and where they came from, that was really the red pill that opened me up to the whole world of paleo-contact. But my other work as a church doctor involved me in community healing and going into situations where there were aspects of the story that were pastoral, aspects that were political, and then other aspects that strongly suggested we were up against kinds of entity that we don't usually talk about in mainstream religion. Things that are explained by more ancient narratives, the Gnostic narratives talking about archons, suddenly gave an explanation for what we were doing in our community healing work when we were getting into entity removal. And so that really expanded my worldview because I didn't have much space for that as a young evangelical believer. But that work forced me to engage with the fact there's more going on than we generally talk about in mainstream conversation.
Yeah, amazing. So everyone who's listening out there, we're talking to a person that was deep, deep, deep in the church for many years. How long were you in the church for?
So 33 years in church-based ministry, and an archdeacon, by the way, in the Anglican Church, that's one down from a bishop. So it's very unusual for a senior church person to step forward and say, wait a minute, everyone, I think we're missing a whole load of content in the Bible. I think it has to do with ancient ET contact. But it was really the translation work, Bible translation work as a theological educator that kept me grounded in these questions and that took me back to the Anunnaki narratives, the narratives of ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria, to realize that's really the bedrock of the biblical stories. And it's the information there that's going to give me the grounding to re-understand what I've been reading all these years in the Bible.
Gotcha. Now, I'm glad I want people to hear these things from somebody else other than me, especially somebody that came, from the church world for decades, to realize that in these ancient texts that you just talked about, Babylonian, Assyrian, so forth and so on, that in these ancient texts, it seems to be the root of a lot of the stories that made it into the biblical stories.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So a few years ago, I took the time to go through the Bible, beginning in the book of Genesis, and just noting some of the anomalies and the stories that we tell from those texts. There are certain things in those texts that don't fit with our familiar Christian and Jewish stories. And when I treated them as translation questions and went to the root meanings of the key words, I recognized that what I was looking at was a summary form of the Mesopotamian stories. And where I found those overlaps, they were almost all points of trauma. So planetary catastrophe occurs in both canons. The generation of human beings and the hybridization of human beings with other more advanced beings, it's in both canons. Arguments among these powerful non-human entities about the human population, how big it should be, how long they should live, how healthy they should be, what access they should have to foods, medicines, water, occurs in both canons. Conflicts among the colonizing non-humans, both canons. Carving up the lands so that they're now managed by non-humans and served by the humans, both canons. On and on it goes. Flood narrative, recovery from the flood.
Yeah.
It's all there, these repetitions. And when I saw the repetitions, it was easy for me to see which telling of the story had come first, and to see that the biblical was a summary of the earlier, and that the earlier was a story of a multiplicity of beings interacting with humanity, and it had been boiled down into what now looks like a God story.
Yeah.
And as I looked at these traumas that seem to be recalled by both canons, I realized those same traumas are reported by other cultures all around the world that have nothing to do with the Middle East, nothing to do with ancient Mesopotamia or Proto-Hebrew literature. You can go to the Yucatan Peninsula. You can go to the Nordic countries. You can go into Africa, into Greece, into India, and the same traumas are described. Different names of characters, different metaphors told, but the same events are being recalled. And that was the white rabbit that got me into the whole territory of paleo-contact.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about the fact that the fundamental cornerstone of a lot of religious beliefs are coming from these super ancient ancestors that left behind records for us to discern and to pay attention to today. I think that from what I've seen over the years of being involved in this field of researching ancient civilizations, paleo-contact, and everything else, is that the not everyone, but a lot of people have seemed to shun our ancient ancestors and what their opinions were and what they witnessed and what they experienced. I'm really wondering, what do you think it is that has created this mindset to where we believe that our ancient ancestors may have been complete bumbling idiots, and anything that they wrote down or anything that they said or anything they left behind for us was just is meaningless?
You're absolutely right. And this has happened through very deliberate and careful messaging by the powers that be, by our governments through the ages. And a classic example of this can be found in the story of the Bible itself. Now, before the 8th century BCE, Judaism was a canon of memory of paleo-contact. the Hebrew stories were full of stories of diverse entities who came, some to help us and nurture us, some to conquer, colonize, and exploit us as a working class. All those stories were washing around in the Hebrew stories until a king came along called Hezekiah, and he worshipped a being called Yahweh. And he was one of these beings, one of the Elohim, as the Bible calls them. And he had a high priest, a Yahwist high priest, Hilkiah, who I think sidled along to him one day, and I'm boiling down a complex story, but to make it relatable, he came along and said, "Sire, don't you think it would be good if everyone in your kingdom worshipped your God instead of their own gods? Because if they worship their own gods, they have their own beliefs, they have their own priesthoods, they have their own ideas, authorities, news agencies. You're not really governing them, are you? But if it's all the same God and your high priest, then we're pulling the kingdom together. You're quite right," says Hezekiah. "They should all worship my God." And so there was a very deliberate effort to get rid of all these other cults and sects. And what that meant was to disband priesthoods that his own ancestors had set up. So Hebrew kings had set up these other priesthoods and had these other temples built and had these art installations created to commemorate contact with these other beings. Now they're going around demolishing the temples, disbanding, sometimes slaughtering the priesthoods, confiscating items used in the commemorations of these other beings. And then Hezekiah's grandson, Josiah, decides to do a similar cleanup of all the Hebrew stories and pull together a canon that now is just about this one entity, Yahweh, that demonizes all the others, that says either they didn't exist or they were false gods or they were demons. So here's the beginning of narrative control. The idea that all the Jewish population prior to the 8th century BCE were bumbling fools, and now we're sophisticated and we know what's what. So it's a very deliberate, careful control of the narrative, a reduction of authorities. So you've now got one king, one high priest, one temple in Jerusalem, all the tithes of the nation coming to that temple under the charge of that high priest. And now there's only the one pyramid-shaped authority telling you what to believe and how to act. Hey, presto, a nice governable society. And I describe all this in my book, The Eden Conspiracy, as a kind of template by which empires have operated from that time to this.